Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we're doing Epic History TV's World War I 1916. Let's get into it.
World War I was supposed to have been a short and glorious war. But by 1916, a new kind of industrialized warfare had seen the death toll soar into the millions, with no end in sight. Naval blockades were beginning to cause shortages of food and fuel across Europe, while thousands of women had entered the workforce, replacing the men sent to fight in their millions. All sides were preparing for a long war. The war has raged for a year and a half as the Allies continue to battle the Central Powers, recently joined by Bulgaria. At sea, the British maintain their naval blockade of Germany, preventing the import of food and other vital raw materials. Germany has retaliated with a U-boat blockade of Britain, but has to limit its attacks to avoid provoking the neutral USA, whose citizens have already been caught in the crossfire. On the Western Front, French, British and Belgian troops are dug in opposite the Germans, both sides trapped in the bloody stalemate of trench warfare. On the Eastern Front, the Russians have ended their long retreat and stabilized the line, but their army has suffered huge losses. On the Italian front, Italian troops have launched a series of costly, unsuccessful attacks against strong Austro-Hungarian defences. While on the Balkan front, the Central Powers have overrun Serbia, whose army is forced to make a bitter retreat through the Albanian mountains. Now, on the 5th of January, Austro-Hungarian troops attack Montenegro. They are delayed at the Battle of Mojkovac, but 3 weeks later, Montenegro is forced to surrender. On the Caucasus front, the Russians launch a surprise winter offensive against Ottoman Turkish forces. 6 weeks later, Russian troops occupy the city of Erzurum. In April, they capture the Black Sea port of Trebizond. Meanwhile, the British transport 2 motorboats to Lake Tanganyika in Africa. They finally arrive after a 10,000-mile trip by sea and land, and help the British seize control of the strategic lake from local German forces. The same month, in German Cameroon, German troops besieged on Mora Mountain for 18 months finally surrender to the Allies. It marks the end of the Cameroon campaign. On the Western Front, the Germans unleash a devastating assault on the French fortress town of Verdun. German General Erich von Falkenhayn knows France will defend this symbolic town to the last man. His plan, in his own words, is to bleed France white in its defense.
And this is a brutal kind of introduction into the new ideas of modern warfare. Remember that when this war starts and through the beginning stages of it, everybody is kind of learning as they go what modern warfare is. They're ditching the ideas of, the frontal charge and bayonet charges and cavalry charges. Those are all suicide now. And coming into the war, those ideas were, for a lot of countries, those were kind of the national idea of how you conduct war. You slam forces into a concentrated area, you break the line. Once the line breaks, then it becomes a full rout, and you send your cavalry in, sweep the enemy off the field. Well, at this point, even at this point, if you were able to break a line, if you sent cavalry in with modern weapons, that retreating, routing army could form up very quickly, turn around, and just machine gun an entire group of cavalry in the snap of a finger. And so those ideas are very, well, not that quickly. There are a lot of British historians that argue that it was not changing nearly quickly enough. But those ideas were changing. And this von Falkenhayn's idea is thoroughly entrenched in the idea of the new modern warfare. It is not a rash offensive. It is not trying to break a line. We are going to grab a hold of a center that is not strategically important. It is kind of culturally and nationally important to France. We are going to grab a hold of it, and we are going to essentially strangle France to death in Verdun by encircling it, making them bring more and more and more troops in, and just making it a meat grinder, a killing field. And yeah, we're going to strangle France to death here. It is a completely detached idea from what war was when this war started to the new ideas of what modern warfare are.
It is the strategy of attrition. Verdun becomes one of the most terrifying battles of the war. A mincing machine, where infantry divisions are destroyed almost as fast as they can be fed into the line. In Britain, 1 million men have already volunteered for military service. But the government realizes it won't be enough. Britain becomes the last major power to introduce conscription. That spring, on the Western Front, British troops are the last to be issued with steel helmets. The nature of trench warfare produces a high proportion of head wounds. The German Stahlhelm, the French Adrian helmet, and the British Mark I steel helmet offer limited protection from shell splinters and shrapnel.
Something kind of sad that Britain introducing conscription made me think of. Before this, Britain had this kind of national campaign to get enrollment up, where they were saying, come enroll with your friends from the neighborhood or your classmates in college, or the groups wherever you're from, whatever town you're from. Come and enlist together, and then you'll be able to serve together. Well, what ends up happening is that in these battles where you have tens of thousands and then eventually hundreds of thousands of men lost, entire areas have all of their sons essentially wiped out because they all went in to enlist together out of this one area. And then they would be part of an offensive at one of the battles, and they would all be wiped out. So it was what you were seeing was specific areas, losing half of their population of male fighting men in a day or in 2 days. And it was just a brutal kind of backfire on what Britain wanted to do to get people to enlist.
Neutral Portugal has been cooperating with the British, which seems to offer the best chance of holding on to her African colony, Portuguese Angola. On the 9th of March, Germany retaliates by declaring war on Portugal. On the Eastern Front, Russia launches an attack near Lake Narok to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun, but it's a disaster. There are 100,000 Russian casualties, and the attack fails to divert any German troops from the fighting at Verdun.
If Russia is attacking Austrian troops, they're doing pretty well. If Russia is attacking German troops, they're getting their ass beat like a drum. Basically, all war, that's how it works.
In Dublin, Irish Republicans launch an armed revolt against British rule. It becomes known as the Easter Rising. and is put down after 6 days of street fighting. In the Middle East, after a 5-month siege, British forces at Kut surrender. General Townsend leads 9,000 British and Indian soldiers into captivity. About half later die from starvation or disease. Britain wants Arab support in its fight against the Ottoman Empire, so it's promised Arab leaders an independent Arab state after the war. But now, Britain and France secretly sign the Sykes-Picot Agreement, planning.
The Sykes-Picot Agreement is actually extremely interesting. A broad general view of what is happening is the British, in return for help, is guaranteeing everything to everybody in this region. And so what ends up happening is, obviously, they can't give everything to everybody. They have an agreement with the French. They have an agreement with local Islamic leaders. They are not going to do any favors here for the future of Israeli-Palestinian relations. They promise every piece of land to every person that could possibly hold a claim to it.
After the war, to divide the Middle East into British and French zones of control. Unaware of this deal, Hussein bin Ali, Sharif of Mecca, leads the Arabs in revolt against Turkish Ottoman rule. In the Battle of Mecca, his forces seize control of the Holy City. On the Italian front, Austro-Hungarian forces launch a surprise attack at Asiago. Italian defences give way. Austro-Hungarian troops are poised to break through into northern Italy. That month, in the North Sea, the German High Seas Fleet clashes with the British Grand Fleet at the Battle of Jutland.
This is the major naval battle of the whole war. I talked about this in the comments of the last video for World War I, but everybody is scared to death that they are going to lose these big, new, expensive ships. And so they never take them out of port, basically. All war, they're kind of just, hanging out. They don't want to lose them. They're scared of other ships. They're scared of submarines. They're scared of mines. They don't know what to expect, and they don't want to lose these big, expensive ships. They're going to come together, have a pretty good clash here at Jutland. Then they're going to realize they actually don't want to lose these ships, and so they're not going to bring them out again.
Only major naval battle of the war, the British suffer heavier losses, but claim victory as the German fleet withdraws and does not re-emerge from its base for the rest of the war. For the summer of 1916, the Allies have planned major simultaneous offensives against the Central Powers, from east and west. Now they are needed more than ever to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun and the Italians at Asiago. The Russians launch their attack first. On the Eastern Front, General Alexei Brusilov has carefully maintained the element of surprise. His troops break through the enemy lines, in some places advancing 60 miles and taking 200,000 prisoners. This brilliant, though costly, Russian attack achieves its aim, as the Central Powers are forced to redeploy troops from other fronts to shore up the line. At sea, British cruiser HMS Hampshire, en route to Russia, hits a mine and sinks off Orkney. Among the 650 dead is Britain's iconic Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener.
And Kitchener had an army that he was putting together, these new raw recruits that were coming in, and he was protecting them, trying to keep them from needlessly being thrown into one of these offensives that doesn't gain anything. And so he's holding this group of, really it's quite a few soldiers. And he keeps saying, like, no, let's not use them. No, let's not use them. And he holds so much sway that he ends up holding everybody off. They are going to take those troops after he dies here, after he supposedly goes down with the ship, and people kind of see him doing this heroic last stand. They're going to take his troops and throw them into an offensive.
3 days later, in the Adriatic, Italian troop ship Principe Umberto is sunk by a German submarine. It's the deadliest sinking of the war, with 1,900 lives lost. On the Western Front, Britain and France launched their major summer offensive, the Battle of the Somme. Hopes are high for a breakthrough, but the first day is a disaster. A long Allied artillery bombardment fails to knock out German defences, and waves of British infantry are cut down by machine gun fire as they advance into no man's land. In the space of a few hours, the British suffer 57,000 casualties, a third of them killed.
And the Somme is one of those where I talked about the British historians that do not believe that the military hierarchy was learning the lessons of modern warfare quickly enough. The Somme is one of those where, holy cow, you can read British historians and military historians of contemporaries of this time and of modern day, where the vitriol for the military hierarchy for the Battle of the Somme is literally dripping off the page as you read it. They are so hate-filled for the way that the generals threw these lives away that while you're reading it, you can literally feel the hatred coming off the page. It's really wild.
It's the worst day in the history of the British Army. But more attacks are ordered, and the battle will rage for another 5 months. Encouraged by the Russian advance, Romania joins the Allies. But despite an initially successful advance into Transylvania, Romania quickly faces a counter-offensive from German, Bulgarian, and Austro-Hungarian forces. The Allied force at Salonika tries to support Romania by launching their own offensive towards Monastir. With Serbian troops in the lead, there are small gains, but dogged Bulgarian resistance prevents a breakthrough. On the Western Front, General von Falkenhayn finally calls off the attack at Verdun. The French army has honoured their commander, General Nivelle's promise. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. But victory comes at a terrible price. 365,000 casualties. The Germans lose almost as many. Verdun remains one of the bloodiest battles in human history. For his defeat at Verdun, Falkenhayn is sacked, and Germany's heroes of the Eastern Front, von Hindenburg and Ludendorff, take command in the West.
And Ludendorff is, he's the hero of Liège from the beginning of the war. He's the one that, goes around the fort and takes the hold of the town, by beating on the door with his sword. It's a really interesting story. He's a really interesting guy. But he basically takes over Germany. When he gets control of the Western Front, he is going to take hold of the German economy, war effort, everything. And he is going to essentially become the military dictator of Germany going forward. He is going to have a very different idea of how to win this war. His idea is going to be based on that to win, essentially one of the other nations is going to have to collapse. That's how the end of the war is going to come. It's not going to come from a breakthrough or anything like that. It's going to be when one of the countries can no longer sustain the war effort. And so he will come to this conclusion that he will give up ground in replace for lives. So he will give up, hundreds of yards or a couple of miles or whatever, with this idea of defense in depth, where the further that the enemy comes into the territory, the further that they come in, the stronger the resistance gets, until eventually you've totally wiped out the group coming in on the offensive. And so they're saying, yeah, sure, we don't have to hold this trench right here. In fact, we'll have defenses going back miles. And then whenever the other side does an offensive, they're not going to hit harsh resistance at the trench. We'll let them come further and further and further back. And as they come, we will just continue to pick them off and pick them off and pick them off until there's none left. So they're saying, yeah, sure, you can take land. We'll take hundreds of thousands of lives, and you can have some land. That's basically the trade he's going to make here. I feel like it's a pretty good idea for where they are in the war. However, he is at a major disadvantage by this point of the war, because the blockade is starting to have an effect now on Germany. They are having a hard time getting food and resources in, and the longer that this goes on, the more of a disadvantage he's at. Britain, France, and Russia, and then eventually the US, they have more people, they have more economic power, so the longer the war goes, the better they are, the more of a leg they have up. And so you see the German hierarchy kind of trying to come up with these different ideas of how they can change that strategic balance of the war.
Meanwhile, the Battle of the Somme continues. Near the village of Flers, the British introduce a new weapon they hope can break the deadlock of the trenches. It is called the tank. But despite some small successes, the first tanks are too few in number and too prone to mechanical failure to make any real impact. On the Eastern Front, Russia's Brusilov offensive comes to an end. Casualty estimates vary wildly, but it's clear both sides have suffered catastrophic losses. Neither the Russian nor the Austro-Hungarian army ever fully recovers. On the Italian front, heavy fighting rages throughout the autumn, as Italian forces make repeated, costly assaults against Austro-Hungarian positions along the Isonzo River. The Battle of the Somme comes to an end amid autumn rain and mud. The Allies have advanced 10 miles at the cost of 600,000 casualties. German losses are about 450,000. The Allies reassure themselves that this is a winning strategy, because at this rate, Germany will run out of men first. Meanwhile, disaster engulfs Romania as the country is overrun by the Central Powers. Romanian forces suffer 250,000 casualties. The remnants of its army take position alongside the Russians on the Eastern Front. That winter, Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria since 1848, dies. He is succeeded by his son, Karl. In Britain, Prime Minister Herbert Asquith is forced from office and succeeded by David Lloyd George, while General Joffre is replaced as French Commander-in-Chief by General Nivelle, who promises victory through bold, aggressive action.
Joffre is a hero in the French mind. I'm almost positive he is not let go. He is like removed. He like fails upward. They want to get him out of Commander-in-Chief, and so they kind of give him a promotion but then take power from him. But he is really, really well liked and a national hero type in France.
The comings and goings, US President Woodrow Wilson's attempts to mediate a peace settlement come to nothing. Neither side is willing to make concessions.
again, I talked about this in the last video, but it's hard to make concessions. It's hard to negotiate for peace whenever you've already given so many lives and resources to the war. And that's something that no side, it's one thing if you lose all of those people, but then on the backside you win the war and you get to dictate the way the world looks going forward. It is just so hard to accept those losses and also a loss in the war. Nobody is willing to hear an ounce of it, and it's going to lead to more death. It's really brutal. So that was Epic History TV's World War I 1916. Like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.